everybody, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to Talking History. If you haven't done so already, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and everything like that. I really appreciate it. And today, we'll have another very special guest on. We'll have Samuel Beckton, and Samuel is a historian of contemporary Irish history with an MPhil in International Peace Studies from Trinity College Dublin, and also an MPhil in Politics from Queen's University Belfast, and undertook a Department of Education PhD scholarship in history from Ulster University in 2022. He's presented research in the Charlotte Aaron public consultation on the constitutional future of the Island of Ireland Committee. And recently, folks, he's just released a new book. It looks absolutely amazing. The Unbroken Covenant. Could Ulster Unionists have controlled the nine-county Northern Ireland between 1920 to 1945? And there's also a book launch this Friday at Prony at 1:45, where Samuel will be launching his new book. Honestly, it looks incredible. And just to remember again, folks, this video and podcast is available on YouTube. But also, if you prefer to listen to your history, please check out Spotify and Amazon Music, where it's also available as a podcast. But without any further ado, let me pass on to Samuel, who'll give us a fantastic talk on this topic. So away you go, Samuel. It's all up to now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Now, this year marks the centenary of the 1925 Irish Boundary Commission. Now, there's many great works coming out this year, but I decided to do something different, to look at a potential path that could have fallen on Irish history. Could have Ulster Unionists controlled a nine-county state? Now, before we do that, we must understand the background. Now, as we know, Ireland has historically been divided up into four historic provinces: Leinster, Munster, Connacht, and of course Ulster North. Now, only 6 Ulster counties became part of Northern Ireland. The counties of Cavan, Donegal, and Monaghan were opted out. But before we understand how a 9-county state could have worked, we need to first understand why was 6 counties chosen instead, and help us understand how a 9-county state could have been chosen instead. This can be broken down into 4 key categories: demographics, politics, geography, and the economy. Now, since the early 1600s, due to Protestant settlers from England and Scotland, the historic province of Ulster is unique from the rest of Ireland, as it had a Protestant majority by the time of the early 20th century. Now, only 4 counties had a Protestant majority. These were Antrim, Down, Armagh, and Londonderry. Now, Tyrone Fermanagh had significant minorities, about approximately 40-45%, but Monaghan, Cavan, and Donegal had much smaller minorities of roughly about 25 to 20%, so roughly 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of the population. Now, this is important to consider because, historically speaking at least, by the time of the early 20th century, if you were Protestant, you were most likely Unionist, and if you were Roman Catholic, you were tended to be Nationalist. Now, there were of course exceptions to the rule, like Sir Dennis Henry, who was the Unionist MP for South Londonderry and the first Lord Justice of Northern Ireland, who was Roman Catholic, whilst Ernest Blythe was from Monaghan. He was from an Ulster Protestant background, and he also was a former member of the Orange Institution, but he won the seat for North Monaghan in 1918 for Sinn Féin, so of course there are exceptions to the rule. But we could see an impact of this affecting local politics. By the time of the 1918 general election, only of 8 Westminster constituencies available for Unionists to stand in the Cavan, Donegal, Monaghan, only 2 were stood by Unionists: East Donegal and North Monaghan, both in which Unionists lost. However, when we considered this, this was worse in Cavan, because whilst Cavan Unionists did consider standing a candidate in West Cavan. They didn't. And to make matters worse, the Irish Parliamentary Party didn't stand any candidates either. So Sinn Féin stood unopposed in the whole county. Now, in terms of these factors, when Unionists weren't strong in Westminster, and it was also not seen as well in local elections as well. As what we have to think about is when we look at these, they was quite small in terms of the ratio in terms of the 1918 general election, in terms of other parts of that would become Northern Ireland. Now, of course, you need to also remember they in the areas they did stand in, they actually were stronger in other parts of Northern Ireland as well. For example, East Donegal Unionists actually had a higher tally of the total votes than compared to their counterparts in East Tyrone. As well, if we have to consider that South Armagh did become part of the new northern state, didn't even stand a Unionist candidate in the first place. But when it comes down to local elections, Unionists was not strong in this pursuit either. But in East Donegal, Strabane number 2 and Londonderry number 2 in East Donegal, these were the only ruled councils that were outside of Northern Ireland that Unionists were able to maintain control. But in overall looking at this showed more justification for 6 counties than compared to 9. But there were other political factors at play. The British government actually thought about the creation of a 9-county state as in early February 1920 in the Road Long Committee. They recommended a 9-county state because of this, because they believed that this would lead to the reunification of Ireland through a simple demographic change, so thus ending the Irish question in the long term. But this was also a reason that why Ulster Unionists didn't want this, so it was changed to 6 counties. But there were 6 county Unionists that favoured a 9-county state. This was because of other factors that need to be considered. First was the 1912 Ulster Covenant. Now, this was a document that was signed in 1912 that promised that the whole historic province of Ulster would be exempt from a Dublin Parliament. And in early 1913 to 1914, a number of regiments and battalions were raised in these 3 counties. 5 were raised in Donegal, 3 in Cavan, and 2 in Monaghan. In fact, they were strong enough that when they were considering drawing the border, one person recommended to include North Monaghan and North Cavan, a member of the civil service, because they believed that due to the strong motivation of these loyalist militias, or potential for these loyalist militias, that it could cause problems for being part of the South. But there were other factors as well besides politics. First was geography. With the inclusion of Donegal alone, you would have reduced the size of the border by roughly 1/3, thus increasing border security. That's just with Donegal alone. Whilst in Monaghan, border Unionists actually argued, because of the way the county was shaped, it acted as, and I quote, a dagger into the heart of Ulster. Now, and this is not taking account of infrastructure of the province at the time. Like, for example, if you were on the railway going from Armagh to Enniskillen, the railway crossed through North Monaghan. And then this comes to the biggest factor of all, the economy. Now, a 4-county Northern Ireland was completely rejected, not just because of the significant number of units in Fermanagh and Tyrone, but because they felt a 4-county Northern Ireland would not have a viable economy. Thus, with 6 counties, it was seen as a good compromise. However, with 9 counties, there would be a much stronger economy. In fact, that this would be seen as a best option economic-wise, because there was much of these areas that were part of hinterlands to the wider economy. For example, East Donegal acted as a hinterland to the market towns of Derry, Londonderry, and of course Strabane and wider Belfast. Whilst some of these other market towns, some goods from all the way in Belfast were trading goods from Monaghan, south of Cavan, and so forth. So with a 9-county state, it would have created a strong northern economy. And a number of unionists in the 6th county were in favour of this. In fact, the Ulster Women Unionist Council voted in favour of a 9-county state. Now, before I continue further, I need to address the elephant in the room. What is the difference between counterfactual history and alternative history? Now, it's like if I talk to my good host here. Let's say we're talking about if Nazi Germany won the war. I'm doing alternative history, so I'm thinking about great works of fiction, like Fatherland or Man in the High Castle. So the great works of fiction, but they don't exactly explain how did the world get to the way it was. They just focus on very brief reasons, not going into depth, and they're not very realistic. However, counterfactual history is completely different. Imagine it's like a shotgun being fired. The end of the barrel is the point of divergence. And each shotgun pellet is an academic assumption. The closer you are to your target, the more likely it'll hit, and thus more quite likely be correct. But the further away you go, it's less likely to be correct. And this is just the same. This is why the book only goes up to 1945. Beyond that, there's too many variables post-war. But this acts like a nice good period to understand what these first fundamental years would be like for the new northern state. And also there is some academic merit to counterfactual history. For example, in early 1974, Sandoz Military Academy actually tried to play a war game. They tried to see if Operation Operation Sea Lion, the planned Nazi invasion of Britain, could have worked in 1940. And they split up in 2 teams, and they tried to figure out, could this happen? And they did this by looking at reports at the time, weather conditions, assets of the German military, assets that were fallen to German hands from France. They looked at Nazi logistics and British logistics at the time, just to come up with a sound answer, yes or no, and determined no. And this is the same thing we're doing for this. First, looking at the academic background, looking at the historic works that were documented about the discrimination that occurred during this period, and including works not just by great academics like Patrick Buckland, for instance, or John O'Brien or others, but also by the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland prior to the Troubles to highlight these discriminations. But also needed to look at data as well. Now, you're looking at a map that was created in 1923 by the Northeastern Boundary Bureau in the Irish Free State. This shows the population of each district electoral division across the historic province of Ulster, as well as Louth and North Leitrim. Now, this is important because for me to do this, I had to map the 1911 census, which is freely available online. And I can tell you, this has taken me 10 years on and off because there's 6,500 townlands and streets that I had to map for these 3 counties. And this is important, as you'll see later on, to understand how gerrymandering could have worked under a 9-county state. Now, the first big question we have to ask is, could unionists take control in early 1921? Now, this was when the first election occurred for the Parliament of Northern Ireland. Now, in our time, Unionists got 40 out of 52 seats, so they had a comfortable majority of 28 seats. Would they still have a majority now? Yes. Only that would be decreased to 20. That's because originally, when Northern Ireland was created, Southern Ireland was created as well. And 6 seats were assigned to Donegal, and 3 seats were assigned each to Cavan and Monaghan. Now, Unionists in the border counties, and this is actually documented in Prony, they recommended to unite Cavan and Monaghan as one constituency, as had occurred to Fermanagh and Tyrone, to maximise the Unionist vote. And it was expected Unionists could return 1 seat out of 6 in both Donegal and in the Cavan and Monaghan constituencies. And even if Nationalists won all the seats, it wouldn't have mattered. How, even though roughly 55% of the population was Protestant across the historic province of Ulster, roughly, because of how the boundaries are drawn up, Unionists would have still got more than what they were entitled to. And then this leads to a good question for Stormont. What next? And that is in local government. Now, at this time, there was a series of local governments that was urban district councils and town commissioners. Then it went into rural district councils and border guardians, and then above that were the county councils. Now, when we start seeing a divergence is in the June 1920 local election. Now, in our timeline, Unionists only got control of Londonderry number 2 and Strabane number 2. Now, when it came to the June 1920 local election, their morale was hit. That's because it was announced earlier that year that there would be a 6th county Northern Ireland than 9. This deeply demoralized Unionists in these regions, as we could see that number of voters didn't turn up at the polls. In fact, Unionists in Cavan, who could have easily returned up to 4 candidates for the county council for the Cavan, didn't even stand any candidates. They just felt very demoralized and then decided to not take part as much. However, with the announcement of a 9-county state, this would have completely changed everything. This would have severely boosted morale and most likely saw a higher vote turnout. But could we have seen a different map? Potentially, in Clones Rural District Council. Unionists at this time actually got 6 seats out of 13. And Sinn Féin got 6 as well, with the Ancient Order of Hibernians getting 1. And the vote was close in some areas. With an increased vote turnout, it's possible they could get the council. But in terms of other areas, no. The Unionists could have got additional seats, but they would not have controlled these councils. And this would send alarm bells across the Ulster Unionist government. Because in our timeline, Unionists controlled 65 out of 106 of these local government authorities in the 6 counties that became Northern Ireland. So they still had the majority. Now, under 9 counties, this would be completely different. It would be 67 out of 155. This would send alarm bells. They would need to start taking steps in order for them to control this northern state. So the first point of call is looking at urban district councils and town commissioners. Now, looking at these towns in the 3 border counties, it's very, very unlikely any of them could have returned a Unionist council. All except for one, Clones. At this time, in 1911, it recorded roughly 36% or 37% Protestant community. Ulster, which had roughly about 35%, were able to return a unionist control government in their local urban council. So how could this have been done? Now, unionists and colonists were actually determined. In fact, they were a few votes shy of actually having more seats on the urban district council than compared to Sinn Féin. So it was a very close election. And this was under STV as well, the single transferable vote. Now, unionists could change this. By mapping out the census of this town, it's possible they could have divided up from this into 5 wards. So what used to be 10 seats would now drop to 9, and unionists could return up to 5 seats in 3 wards, whilst nationalists could return 4 seats in 2 wards, with the majority of the population being in the northeast and southeast. Now, it's notice another thing you have to remember, it's not just simply drawing boundaries or even changing the electoral voting system, but it's also changing the electoral franchise. This is going to the ratepayers franchise. Now, at this time, it meant that if you and your spouse had owned a property and tenant, then you would have a vote. Now, this favored smaller families than larger ones. So it meant, which traditionally Protestants tended to have smaller families than compared to Roman Catholic counterparts. Another thing as well, it was the business vote. So some businesses actually got an additional vote per business they had in that local or government ward. So this would to really help unionists, and this explains why the East Ward, which includes the diamond, the heart of the town, where a lot of businesses were in the town. But it's not just simply doing this as well. It's also possible they could have expanded the boundaries of the town to include parts of, let's say, Clonboy in the west of the town and strengthen these Protestant holdings. And this comes from real world examples. For example, in Armagh in 1948, prior to the end, unionists were not able to take control, as they only were able to control 1 ward out of 3. However, after expanding the boundaries of the town, that include more rural farmland that were unionist, suddenly unionists were able to control 3 out of 5 wards. So it's possible unionists would have done the same tricks here in the border counties. Now, this is the most important of all, the district electoral divisions. Now, these were the bread and butter of local government. These formed the seats for rural district councils, and they were the building blocks for county council seats and Stormont seats. And unionists redrew them in the early 1920s, because by doing this, you changed the number of seats, and you also changed where those seats were to help change the game so that you had a better chance of winning. And this could be seen here if we look at Donegal Rural District Council, for instance. Now, prior to then, when it was first passed the post from 1899 to 1914, unionists were only able to earn 3 seats out of 18. Now this could change from 9 out of 16, including a new district electoral division from nearby Ballyshannon Rural Council. And it's quite interesting as well. Some of these new constituencies would be artificially bigger than what they should be, just because they're expanding into rural lands like mountains and stuff like that to make them look bigger. than they actually were, just to make the seats look more justified, when actually it was only a smaller population that was returning the council. And the same for Clonus, if we look, for example. Going from 4 out of 13 to now 9 out of 14. And you see the red line. That is the county boundary for Cavan and Monaghan. This would have changed to include Ashfield, a very strong Protestant district electoral division, and some other nearby townlands. Now, when we look, this is not far-fetched. When we think about the 1899 Local Government Act, that act in 1899 actually changed some county boundaries slightly to include certain districts or to fit certain council lines and so forth. And this wouldn't have been far-fetched to change the boundary line for Cavan Monaghan slightly to help favour Unionists. And then Ballyborough, going from 0 out of 13 to now 5 out of 9. These are just using the exact same townlands, just rearranged in a different manner, using the exact same 1911 census. This is the same information that Unionists would have had as well. So we can see how some of these demographics completely change and rewrite how these maps would look like. And it would have also affected rural councils as well. Now, other tricks that Unionists did during this time was either dissolve rural councils and help merge them together. For example, if we look at Cavan, for instance, this would now include instead of having Castlereagh or Mullaghran rural councils, which would just give that would be under control of nationalists. So instead of having 3 councils, you can merge them together and have 1. And you know what's more important as well? Rural councils were important for Ulster Unionist planners, because it's not just simply controlling another council. Each rural council that was controlled by a political party gave you 1 seat on the county council. So if you were trying to control the county council, each seat that you can acquire from these rural councils already gave you a leg up to help control the wider county council. And you can see as well that a new council could be created and built a bit. Now, this didn't happen in our timeline, but new urban councils were created during this time as well, in the early 1920s and 1930s by Ulster Unionists, as to help protect their interests, either to help protect their interests and make sure that certain nationalist areas didn't make it harder for Unionists to control some rural councils, or to allow Unionists to have control in certain areas where they couldn't control, like in South Down and stuff like that. Now, if we look at Monaghan, on the other hand, you go from having Unionists controlling 0 out of 4 to now 2 out of 3. Now, even despite all these efforts, Unionists were still being limited by what was available. So if we look at Donegal, for instance, yes, the east and south and parts of north were strengthened, as there's a lack of Protestants in further west. There's little to work with. So there's sometimes some limitations to what could have been. But still, they would have tried to maximize their efforts. So Unionists could have gotten from controlling only 2 out of 10 rural councils to now controlling 5 out of 8. But here comes the big question. Could Unionists control the county councils? Now, from 1899 to 1914, none of these councils were ever controlled by Unionists. Now, if we look at in Monaghan, they only managed to return up to 4 seats, and one of these were in the south. That's because local nationalists let them have the seat, just to show a symbol of good faith. And this actually led to a number of accusations from 1899 to early 1901 from both unionists in both in Donegal and in Monaghan, that the local government board had gerrymandered them as their rights of fair representation, as they argued, as they represented a fourth of the population, in some cases, and paid half the rates. They deserved more representation. Now, with this, it's possible unions could have, by focusing on smaller constituencies, they could have had a majority, 10 out of 18. And with the rural council seats as well, they could have had a few more seats. Plus, this is important for all councils they controlled, they could get up to 2 or 3 co-options, so adding additional members to help secure their control. And what's more interesting as well, that in some cases, unionists could have gotten in control anyway, because partly of nationalist boycotts that took place for elections in the early 1920s and early 1930s to some extent. Because they believed by not participating in the northern states, they would delegitimize it. But it's only benefited unionists. Like, for example, councils like Newry Rural Council, which was designed for nationalist control. Unionists were able to control it at first in the early years because of these nationalist boycotts. And this would be very similar. So they could actually get more seats than what people thought was fair. But even with gerrymandering taking place, there's only certain limitations. For example, or Cavan, yes, they were never able to elect their own candidate for the county council. But even with all the best gerrymandering, the problem is Cavan is different from Donegal and Monaghan. In North Monaghan and East Donegal, they had substantial communities to have a strong voting base. However, here in Cavan, the Protestant and Unionist community were quite well spread, and this was their weakness. So the best they could hope for was 2 seats in the east and 2 seats in the west. That is it. And that is the most optimistic version. But Donegal was the most unique. Now, prior from 1899 to 1914, local unionists argued gerrymandering took place as the constituencies of Letterkenny, Lifford, and Pedigo were drawn in such a way that unionists were not able to get elected in these seats. They were only able to obtain 2 seats in the east. Now, even with gerrymandering and stuff like that, this would not have been possible to control the entire county. This is because it would be like trying to control Cavan and Monaghan combined with the same seats as one county for the county council. The problem is, like, for example, if we looked at the district electoral divisions. Now, the smallest constituency that was created was in Monaghan, for Monaghan town, which include Monaghan urban and Monaghan rural, while some of the biggest ones in Donegal include up to 11 district electoral divisions. So there was such a big geographic difference. It would not have been possible. However, it could have been possible to control half the county. And that is because of the British government. The British government set a legal precedent through Tipperary. Now, that's because Tipperary was divided up into 2 county councils instead of 1. North Tipperary, Tipperary County Council and South Tipperary County Council, for administrative purposes and geographical issues. The Unionists could argue that the county council had been split into two for administrative purposes. And it's possible, or they could control the northeast, and it's not just simply trying to control half the county, and also allow a majority of the Unionists to control their local affairs. But it's also for symbology as well, that the most northern point of Ireland was under northern Unionist control. They control the first 7 points of Ulster, which is in Cavan, or the most western in West Donegal, but they could at least ensure they controlled North Donegal, and thus the most northern point of Ireland. Now, in the late 1920s, STV was scrapped for general elections in Northern Ireland. Now, this made a big difference because Unionists were able to return first past the post and increase the number of seats they actually took place by gerrymandering the seats into their favour. But would this be a good thing for border Unionists? Now, if we were drawing absolutely perfect seats, this would have looked absolutely very gerrymandered and uneven. Like Mid Monaghan have gone from 11,500, while South of Monaghan would be 41,000. And the same in Cavan. If Mid Cavan was created, would be 13,000, and whilst East Cavan that would be 61,000. So great big differences. But these are completely unrealistic, because it's not simply about drawing them that Unionists had to think about. They also had to hide it in a different way, and that was through population numbers. So even though we saw on the map they were drawn in such a way to favor Unionists, they hid it by showing the population for each of these constituencies. They approximately made up the same number. In Armagh, Tyrone, County Londonderry, the borough of Londonderry, and Fermanagh, of course, Antrim, Down. They did it in such a way to justify this just by these numbers. And this would be the same for Unionists in the border counties as well. So a more realistic approach would have been Mid-Monaghan would not have had a Unionist majority. It would have most likely been about 50-50 at that, at best. Whilst in Cavan, Unionists would not have been able to create their own constituency. They would not have been strong in any of them. But in Mid-Cavan, they would have at least made up a third of the population, giving them the same fighting chance Unionists did in North Monaghan and East Donegal in 1918, hoping that a national split would allow them to get the seat. But in Donegal, Unionists would have been able to retain the seat. But still, in the end, these are still tight numbers. It's not a solid majority. So East Donegal and North Monaghan in later years could have certainly been a battleground seat between local nationalists and Unionists. Now I've talked about the elections, how they could get into control. Now I should understand what happens after taking control. We hold what we have. Now, since the 1860s, the Protestant community had been declining in these counties, both in terms of numbers and the ratio they constituted within their counties. Now, post 1911, we don't know what the census would look like, but it's highly likely that Protestant numbers would still be higher than what we saw in our timeline, but they would still be in decline due to this general pattern. So the question is, how do we stem the tide? This is what Unionists would be asking themselves. First of all, is looking at security. Now, in early 1920s, during the War of Independence, a number of former UVF shells were revived, which were particularly quite effective in North Monaghan, East Donegal, and South Donegal. In fact, they were so strong in some areas that they actually acted as a fifth column for British security forces in North Monaghan. So they were quite effective guerrilla fighters against the IRA and local bandits. In fact, the Northern government eventually took control of some of these revived loyalist militias that were popping up in Northern Ireland. They eventually started giving them training and uniforms, and these would become the first of the infamous Ulster Special Constabulary, or B Specials. And a number of them actually got a lot of equipment from a First World War surplus. Now, following the First World War, the British government had a lot of ammunition and arms that needed to get rid of. There were stories of them actually dumping it in the sea because it was cheaper then compared to storing it. So when the Northern Irish government actually requested a number of arms, I believe it was over 1 million rounds of ammunition and 50,000 rifles. I think that there was a lot of arms that took place. This bill was the British government was happy to provide to help secure the northern state. And this request could certainly have been bigger to secure the 9 counties, and the British government would have easily been able to provide it, as it would have either been given it to the northern state, or they would have had to just dump it into the sea. But it's not just simply security during the War of Independence, but it's also pull factors to keep Protestants in these communities. Now, with each council that units were able to control, they were able to provide local Protestants preferences in local government work, housing, funding opportunities, preferential treatment. The Irish language would not be imposed in local education. So there would have been a lot of opportunities for local Protestants. And also trade would not have been disrupted by the creation of the border towards the north. And also the Ulster Unionists would depend on the Orange Order. Now, during this time, in the first cases of a land purchase scheme for local Protestants was first seen in 1920 in Donegal, which helped local Protestants to pay off their debts, and particularly help local rural Protestant farmers. Now, under ST Fitty, this worked quite well and was known to be quite successful in our time, and to an extent, this still continues. However, with first past the post, this would change. Some areas would be focused to maintain and protect local units' interests. So focusing those are for county council seats and Stormont seats as well. Those outside that would not get the same funding opportunities. So we could see some of the Protestant communities start to focus more onto areas that they could deem secure. Now, I can't talk about the centenary of the Boundary Commission without talking about it itself. Now, in our timeline, Judge Beetham from South Africa was the chairman, whilst Northern Irish representative was Fisher, who was the former editor for the Northern Whig and was actually appointed by the British government to represent the Northern Irish government, as the Ulster Unionist government refused to take part in the commission, whilst for the Irish Free State they chose McNeill instead, then as they believed he would serve their interests quite well, as he knew the rural area quite well, as he was actually elected for the TD for Donegal. Now, These men would have been completely different under this timeline. This is because the idea of a commission was actually suggested by James Craig and shown in case of 9 counties. Now, if a 9-county state was occurred, then the Northern Irish representative would be different because the Northern government would take part. And because they took part, the chairman would be different. This is because Beetham wasn't the first choice. Sir Robert Borden, the former Prime Minister of Canada, was the first choice. And he turned down the job only because he wanted he would only take the job if both the Free State government and the Northern Irish government both participated with the commission. Since Northern Ireland didn't, he stepped aside. Now, with both governments taking part, it's likely he could accept the job. And then the representative of the Free State could change as well, because the minister that was chosen was actually a TD from Donegal, and it's possible that he would not be elected. It would not be chosen. Instead, it could be somebody else. So the whole commission could completely change. But what would the Boundary Commission look like? Now, just looking at the frontiers alone, this is what it could look like. With they're just focused on the frontiers, and it's likely they would as well for the same reasons it was chosen in our timeline. Now, and I was pointed out at one point that they couldn't transfer 450,000 people to the south, and 200,000 of those were Unionists, just for the benefit of making 50,000 people happy. So it was more realistic for the Boundary Commission to choose the frontiers than make large territorial exchanges. So it's possible this would have been the same case. So it could see approximately 100,000 people transferred to the south. However, some areas of the south could be considered to be transferred to the north, particularly from South Leitrim. Now, each orange townland that you see represents a townland with a Protestant majority. And this is under the 1911 census. And each the yellow line that you see, which you see 5 yellow lines, represent a townland with an orange hall. Now, at this time, the Orange institution in this county had strong connections, and still do, with their counterparts in Cavan. In fact, at their own loyalist militia prior to the First World War. And there's actually accounts of Leitrim Unionists and Protestants actually drilling with the Cavan UVF regiment. And there's a number of executive officers actually for the Orange Order of Leitrim actually resided in Cavan. So it's possible that some of these townlands could have been ceded to the north. But this would have still been very minuscule. Only probably seen about 878 people, roughly. But still, this would have been done by the Commission to show, 1, fairness in its dealings, and 2, that this would have been supported particularly by Cavan Unionists, as not because it would strengthen their position, though mildly. It was because whatever areas that were ceded to the north would mean that their areas would not be ceded to the south. So it was a matter of self-interest. But it's still likely that the work of the Boundary Commission would fail. That is because of greed, you could argue. Both sides wanted different things. The North wanted only small changes in some cases, whilst the Free State government would have claimed not only just the border counties, but also wanted to claim Fermanagh, Tyrone, South Armagh, South Down, the city of Derry, Londonderry, and these were non-negotiable for some Unionists. I think the best way to describe it is a quote from Winston Churchill. During the Second World War, he once argued, "It was the nation and the race dwelling all around the globe that had the lion's heart. I had the luck to be called upon to give the roar." And this would have been the same thing. No matter who came to be part of the commission, they would have had the same issues. They would have, they could have had James Craig, and you had, could have had, sorry, you could have easily had the head of states of both Northern Ireland and the Free State being the representatives on the commission for their respective countries on the commission. And you could have had the General Secretary of the League of Nations as chairman, and it wouldn't have mattered. So I think it was doomed to fail no matter what the situation was, sadly. Now, I want to look at one last thing as well. How would symbolism change in the 9 counties? First is the flag. So could we have seen the Ulster banner in this world? Now this was created for partition, and the 6 points of the star represent the 6 counties of Ulster. So could we see 9-point star instead? No. This was created in the early 1920s because there was no symbol for the 6 county area, so something new had to be created. So this was created for the Parliament of Northern Ireland as the coat of arms. It didn't become the flag until by 1953 by the visit of Queen Elizabeth II to Northern Ireland. Now, during the same visit, another flag was witnessed. This was called the unofficial flag of Northern Ireland. And this was actually documented back to the Third Home Rule crisis, hanging outside some anti-Home Rule movement meetings, like one in Belfast, detailed with a Union ensign at the top, with blue background like many British territories, the hand of Ulster in the middle, but with 9 stars instead of 6. It only became 6 stars following partition. But it's unlikely this would be the flag as well. Instead, it's likely that the flag of the province of Ulster would be chosen instead. This is because of numerous reasons. One of them, it would actually get support from a local or nationalists as well for the new northern states, because they would see it as part of the wider 4 provinces of Ireland. But it's also because of unionist interest as well. This was the symbol of the Ulster Unionist Council during this period, from 1905 onwards. And it's not just because it was important for the flag, but it also helped give reinforced evidence to help change the name. Now, there was a few attempts in our timeline to change the name of Northern Ireland to Ulster. One during the 1930s when the Irish Free State was renamed Eire, and in 1948 with the creation of the Republic of Ireland. Now, this had the approval of Ulster Unionists, but also some in the British government actually favoured this as well. But one of the obstacles, of course, was it was only 6 counties, not 9. Now, with 9 counties, this move could have been made much easier. But it's still possible this still wouldn't have happened. This because some of these moves were made during, like, for example, the 1930s, when there was an economic trade war between Britain and Ireland. Now, just changing the name of Northern Ireland to Ulster would have infuriated the Irish government. And for the British government, they didn't want to cause more deterioration of trade relations just for the sake of one name. but as well as the name of Northern Ireland, it's the monuments as well. Now, this is a monument that's actually built in front of Cavan Circuit Court. And this was established in the early 1950s. This is dedicated to those IRA volunteers that died during the War of Independence. Now, in our timeline, this would never have been erected. This because even though if it would have the support of the local town council, the local rural council, and of course the county council, it wouldn't have had the support of Stormont that would have enforced the Special Authorities Act, as this would be a symbol of insurrection, so thus a danger to the northern state. But other monuments would be prioritized instead, particularly those for the First World War and then later the Second World War, as symbols of loyalty. Now, in Cavan, they chose instead to focus on making a plaque for the hospital ward. In this case, they would more focus on trying to have something more public, like a monument like this. And there are many other changes that we can discuss, but I think we need to get down to the basics. Could Ulster Unionists control 9 counties? Yes. But in terms of local government, this would have been limited to certain areas, and of course, for a certain period of time. Beyond 1939 or beyond the Second World War, Unionists would have certainly gradually lost control in these counties. Like if we look at Limford Rural Council, this was controlled by Unionists for decades. But following the Second World War, Nationalists took control because of demographic changes. This would have been the same thing, not just in demographic changes, but also because Nationalists were taking part in elections again, no longer boycotting. So it would have been a good period of time for Unionists in the first few decades, but then they would have lost what they had. But if we had a fast forward, things could we see in the modern era? Could we have seen a united Ireland? Potentially. I would say to people who ever ask this question, it would depend if you are a gambler or not. The odds are we would most likely see a united Ireland. That's only because we look at demographics. I believe in the early 2000s, it was reported for the first time that the historic province of Ulster had a Roman Catholic majority for the first time in centuries. And since then, that's only increased. Now, what would that mean? If we thought of the traditional lines of Roman Catholics being nationalists and Protestants being unionists, then yes, that looks like it most likely being likely that the United Ireland would occur. But you need to remember a growing number of Roman Catholics are becoming unionists, the same as Protestants becoming nationalists. We've had economic crisis in the last few decades. We've had COVID, and a lot of people are now focusing on bread and butter issues. And they could have seen other things as well. So it's still possible we could have seen Northern Ireland centenary under 9 counties. We do not know. But there's other things that this timeline could have seen as well. What could the Troubles have been like? What kind of discrimination could we have seen just for units to try to maintain such control? I do not know. And to be honest, I found it an ethical challenge to do this, as well as an academic challenge. And if I had to say one thing that I found from all this, it's that both sides of Ulster Unionism were right and wrong. And I believe that for Irish nationalists as well, 6-count partition was horrible, but it could have been much worse if a different boundary line had been chosen. Thank you.
Well, Well, first of all, Samuel, thanks very much for your talk, and I'm sure everybody will appreciate the amount of detail and effort you went in not only to this presentation you give us, but also your like entire research for the book. It was actually incredible. I really enjoyed well a lot of it, but I really enjoyed stuff like the shotgun analogy,
Mm,
the linkage to Tipperary and stuff, and also the symbolism.
mm,
Um the flags, and I'm sure everybody will appreciate as well. You sort of mentioned it at the end there about how topical this subject that you're actually interested in still is to this very day. um, say, well, I'm not going to get into more things here, but stuff
mm,
about the border poll and all. This is all very topical, as I'm sure
mm.
you're very aware. But I'm just
Yes.
going to ask you a quick two questions related to it. Well, related to everything. What got you interested in this specific area of history in general?
I think for myself, what got me most interested about this was I quite liked I quite like this early period of history just because it could have gone different ways,
Mm,
and you have to think as well that it a very unique period of history because it could there's such strong feelings and
mm,
there was I think what it is it's just a unique story between Irish unionism and Irish nationalism,
mm,
as both sides saw each other as traitors to
mm,
the interest of Ireland, and in an interesting way, they were both unique from the rest of the British Isles because yes, they were Irish nationalists had a unique Irish identity, but even for Ulster Unionists, they had a unique form of a British identity as well.
mm,
And what is quite interesting as well is, in some ways, they were more progressive than some of their counterparts in Britain. Like, for example,
mm,
Ulster Unionists had promised if they had established a Northern Parliament, if a civil war took place prior to the First World War, that women would have the right to vote for
mm,
this new Parliament.
mm.
So, and the same for Irish nationalists, that they were quite well forward,
Yeah.
and they actually stood two women as candidates in
Mm,
1918. So, the rights of women in Britain were furthered because of women in
yeah.
Ireland, and
Mm,
ironically, those were nationalist women.
mm.
But
It's
but what I found it interesting is just there were so many scenarios. People offered different
mm,
boundary lines. Some people offered different solutions, like Dominion status, making an Irish Republic, or making uh, s- like or perhaps partition, but only for a number of years.
mm,
There were so many different ideas, and the boundary lines changed differently. Were Westminster constituencies, rural government boundaries? There was so much up in the air.
mm,
It's quite interesting, and it served as a template for other partition schemes later down the line, like in India, for instance.
mm.
And like this because the what ifs and the could have beens.
Yeah, and as you sure you're much more aware than me, it's still very much a topic, as I says, very open to debate. I'm sure you're probably going to discuss this a lot more at the conference that you're attending on
Yes.
Friday. But it's so interesting. And as I say, folks, check out the conference, check out his book launch. It should be fantastic. And his book. I'm just going to finish with this question, Samuel. Is there any other areas linked to this that you're researching or hope to research? Or is there any other area of history that you possibly feel needs more greater research, whether it's linked to this or anything else that you're looking at?
Well, one of the things I'm particularly looking at the moment, I'm doing a series of exhibitions in the border
Mm,
counties,
mm,
looking at the Protestant Association history. Now,
mm,
the Protestant associations of Cavan, Donegal, and Monaghan were the former Unionist associations of these counties that, following partition, they no longer could focus on Unionist interests, so they focused
mm,
on the Protestant interests instead. And they actually stood uh, independent candidates for general and local elections up to 1999, 2004. So 4 generations of the Protestant community will rally together to elect these candidates together.
mm,
And these exhibitions are going to show local relics. So each
mm,
of these counties in Donegal, Cavan, Monaghan are showing local relics of those particular counties. So one is already launched in Donegal at the moment, and that's going on till 22nd of November.
mm,
There'll be a launch in 6th of December for Cavan County Museum, and there'll be one on 7th of February for Monaghan Peace Campus.
mm,
And these, and it's quite interesting that and this is the research of that was actually helped feed this research because I looked at a full centuries worth of the history of these Protestant communities in these counties, and that's helped me write this book. And other things I believe that needs further study. I believe there needs to be further work on the Ulster Unionist movement, but outside of Ireland,
mm,
as I've written works about the anti-home rule movements in South Africa, New Zealand, Australia,
mm,
and the United States, and I'm hoping to create a book in the near future to actually put all these together, to also talk about the UVF regiments that were formed in Canada and Britain, as well as compare and the money that was raised across the British Empire. There's some of the money that was raised for Ulster Unionists include
mm,
places like Hong Kong, the Amazon, even Arabia.
mm,
So that's actually something I believe is not well understood. Because yes,
mm,
there was a lot of support from the Irish community for home rule in terms of the Irish diaspora. But there was also a lot of that diaspora hoping to help the anti-home rule movement.
mm,
And last thing I think that needs to be done, but in a failing a lesser extent, I I'm not sure I would ever write a counterfactual history again. It was just a unique challenge.
mm,
But I do think there shouldn't be a taboo to it. Some people looked at me and thought it's a bit. Is it fiction? Is it history? It's a what if. But I
mm,
think it helps engage the public to these
mm,
topics, and it's not just that. It can helps us to ask questions that should be asked, like did we make the right decisions? Did we dodge a bullet by not choosing certain other decisions? And that's what I wanted for this book, to help give an answer to those communities that felt that they were part of the abandoned free,
mm,
uh, as some have called it in some cases, and also to highlight in a new lens the injustices that occurred in Northern Ireland prior to the Troubles. So both sides of the community can find something in this book.
mm,
That is my hope. And I really, really do hope that it will inspire other people to write other counterfactual histories, not as a general rule of thumb, but just to help create a new kind of debate
mm,
that, and I also hope to see what the future will hold, and also more importantly, what other people think of this work.
mm. No, but as first of all, thanks very much, Samuel.
No,
And
thank you.
as you were saying there, even some of the stuff you were thinking about doing in the future, like I never knew that whatsoever. Obviously, I knew about the Irish diaspora and stuff, but
Mm.
places like Hong Kong and the Amazon and stuff,
Oh,
to me,
yes.
it definitely
And
sounds very interesting.
yep, there's even a Hong Kong Orange Lodge
There
prior
you
to the
go.
First World War. There's
Mm,
actually a photo of them you can find on some newspaper archives like the Belfast Weekly News.
mm,
And they actually had, I believe, they raised some money, and they also published, I think, a resolution as well
mm,
for Ulster Unionists. So showing how unique the Irish diaspora was during this
mm,
period.
mm. And as you say, I do think there's very much scope for that.
Mm,
And it sounds was a great idea. And just come back to your last point as well about how you use like not people to be put off by counterfactual history and stuff. The what if, it is one of the questions that always drives us, not just in history, but in all aspects of life, even like sport. Like I always say, what if Steven Gerrard never slipped, for example, as a Liverpool fan? Do you know what I mean? So it does, the what if question does drive engagement, and I think this will help with your book. And as I say, folks, definitely check out his book. As I say, a lot of information was given in the presentation itself, but I'm sure there's a lot much more within the book.
Oh, there's a
Be-
lot more.
Mhm.
The book also covers much more detail that I couldn't discuss. One of the key chapters alone, it discusses the impact nine counties would have been on during the Second World War,
There you go.
and
Mhm.
other other factors that could be considered. Like for example, in the conclusion, although the book focuses from 1920 to 1945, there's also an epilogue to look at some general trends that could have likely have seen. What could we have seen? For example, ideas for the Troubles, for instance,
Mhm.
or what could we have seen for the last elections prior to the Troubles?
Mhm.
What the border poll that took part in the 70s what would the result have been? And there many other questions
Mhm.
that are drawn, and there's other topics as well that I think would be quite interesting for everyone. So yeah,
Yeah.
but thank you.
So definitely check that out, folks. As I say, not only interested to Irish historians, British historians. I think the Irish and the Unionist diaspora is everywhere, as Samuel has just mentioned. So definitely do check out his book. And as once again I mentioned as well, he is doing a book launch at Prony at the big conference on Friday at 1:45. So if you can attend that, by all means, check it out. But yeah, we just want to finish once again by saying thanks so much to our guest today, Samuel. It's absolutely
Thank,
fantastic talk. And I'll see you all again next time, folks, for more talk on history. See you soon. Bye
thank
bye.
you very much. Bye.
Start. Yep, but that's stop.